tradition, and of course that impacts directly on your underlying theme of Thelema.
Excellent. Well, with no further ado, I will lead into the talk that you gave at William Blake Oasis in mid-November 2005.
Hope you all enjoy it.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to William Blake Oasis, OTO, in the D.C.-Baltimore metropolitan region. We would like to welcome this evening Bishop T Allen Greenfield from Atlanta, who is going to talk to us this evening about the history and prehistory of the OTO.
I want to start out by saying that magic, and ritual magic in particular, has a very, very odd history. I think history is very odd anyway. You have this situation where historical events, if you've lived through a few, and I've been around long enough that I have, get remembered in 5,000 different ways, even in the lifetime of the people that they happen in. And that's ordinary, mundane history. Now take that and add to it that you're dealing with the history of secret societies, quote unquote, whatever that may be. And they're actively trying not to leave too much in the way of a historical trail, or at least not an historical trail that is other than what they want to be out there. And the further back in time you go, the more difficult it is to really know what is and what isn't, because for one thing, there isn't much of a paper trail. I've, for the last 15 years, followed the rule of thumb that you attempt to get to the essence of what my friend John Sellers calls the authentic tradition. And where you find that, you're likely to find a trail of thought, of unique ideas that help you to sift out what is essentially experimentation, con games, and everything in between to the authentic magical tradition, which I believe the modern OTO to be an integral part of and descendant of. I have worked my way backwards through my books and other writings to 1700. My current book, The Roots of Magick, deals with the period 1700 to 2000, and that pretty much covers the immediate prehistory of the OTO and the history of the OTO as presently constituted. I should say that anything that I say about the history of the OTO specifically is, although I am a Grand Lodge officer, I'm not speaking for the OTO. In fact, if you read the official current history of the order, you'll find several fairly profound differences between what I think is the case and what the U.S. Grand Master thinks is the case in his interesting history of the order in modern times. I'd like to work forward for purposes this evening from the 1600s on. Prior to the 1600s, there was a very, very interesting disconnect in the Western ceremonial magic tradition. I call it looking at things from both sides of the ghetto wall, because that's exactly what it was in some places and sort of what it was everywhere. Generally speaking, what's considered to be the Western ceremonial magic tradition today is what was going on the Gentile side of the wall in Europe. That includes a lot of things that are sort of second and third hand Kabbalah and things that are considered to be, quote, Jewish or Judeo-Christian magic, but is usually either spurious or sort of from a defector and sanitized for public consumption. There was an entirely different tradition going on in the ghettos of Europe, and Jewish magic and non-Jewish magic up to the 1600s were living independent lives. There was a lot of intrigue, one about the other. Mostly non-Jewish people of a metaphysical bent were intrigued by these mysterious people that muttered in ancient languages and perhaps had some ideas that they didn't know about. There wasn't much interest on the other side of the ghetto wall because they were very insular. There were reasons it was called a wall. They basically lived an autonomous life and didn't, for all intents and purposes, didn't know they were in Europe. But the entire history of that period can be capsulized by saying that if you see something that says that it's the grimoire of King Solomon, take it with a grain of salt. It was a good way to sell manuscripts at that time to claim that this is the secrets of the Jews. It's sort of like Secrets of the Gypsies 100 years ago. It was very popular, and usually by people who had only this most scant knowledge of what gypsies were all about and what magic or non-magic or con game, as the case may be, they were involved in. In the 1600s, there was a resurgence of interest in magic in Europe in general, in part spun off by the Protestant Reformation in Europe. When Catholicism and Protestantism divided, it created wars, revolution, general mayhem, and it also created a new assessment of the magical tradition. It came out as something we call Rosicrucianism, and it had its own mythos, it had its own benchmarks and its own ideas about what that tradition was all about. It had a series of books that came out that became increasingly popular. Whether there were actually people involved in these societies or whether it was just something that a few people that wanted to say something sort of created as a literary device has been much debated. I think they existed at that time. They certainly existed by a century later. They sort of actualized, but my best educated guess is that they existed as an integral group. And they had a lot of astrology, a lot of alchemy, started to introduce tarot, already had some notion of a graded system of initiations. And the central gnosis of magic, which is what I call the core of the authentic tradition, the sexual magic tradition, which was very popular in the East and very much a no-no in Western civilization in general, was deeply embedded in the Rosicrucian tradition by the 1600s. Whether, again, this was a few people or a fairly widespread group of scholarly people, I really don't know. We probably never will know because all we have are the literary remnants. There are no personal diaries or anything available that will indicate anything more than aspects, just as today, right as I'm speaking, Kabbalah has a wide following. Madonna is always mentioned, and some of us cringe, some of us are happy to see people on board, but a lot of people are suddenly newborn Kabbalists of some sort or other, and there was a similar thing in the late 1600s, early 1700s. And we want to take a look, for purposes of the end of that period, where you have two different magics, Jewish magic and Gentile magic, or to be more precise, Christian European magic and Jewish magic. By looking at the end of that period, we don't have to do too much exploration because it basically stays pretty much the same from the time of ancient Rome until the 1600s. At the end of that period, while Rosicrucianism is starting to be discussed in certain intellectual circles and certain spin-offs like Enochian magic begin to happen and again, I'm using the time period in a sort of loose-knit sense. In Elizabethan England, you have the interest in Enochian magic and in astrology and in alchemy. In other words, as isolated subjects. not necessarily having a lot of crossover, and not necessarily having any kind of organized society being involved. There was just interest, fad, like unicorn necklaces. It was the unicorn necklace of its day. During that same period, in the world of Eastern European Jewry, and in Spain, notably, which had technically the Jews had been expelled from Spain in 1492 along with the Muslims, and most of those people found a home either in the Arab world or in the Low Countries in Europe, and you see a lot of Kabbalistic magic and sort of the particularly Jewish magical experience spreading from those centers out into Central Europe and then into Eastern Europe, and indeed into Asia Minor. Had an entirely different type of perspective on it. For one thing, the Kabbalism was good. It wasn't third hand, it wasn't washed out. It was done by people who actually knew what the Hebrew letters meant, not that they were little obscure marks. If you get any standard magical texts from that period, they have these horrible Hebrew glyphs that are totally undecipherable. They look sort of Hebraic, and they're squiggles and bear some resemblance to Hebrew, but not much, and they don't make any sense at all. You had good scholarly knowledge, but no soul in it, because Judaism at that time was extremely conventional. It was a matter of a series of ritual practices. In the 1600s, a combination of a new burst of Kabbalistic interest, along with Messianic expectations, began to change the nature of magic inside the Jewish community in Europe and in other places. And that in turn generated several movements which were extraordinarily interesting, pretty much unknown outside of the ghetto. One was the Messianic movement centered around a guy by the name of Shabbatai Tzvi, variously pronounced, and rightly so, because it probably was pronounced differently from country to country. Darkly rumored to involve orgiastic rites and all sorts of forbidden things, mostly by Orthodox Jews that didn't particularly like what these people were saying. And having a radical notion that this guy was going to lead the Jews back to the Promised Land. And he indeed eventually came to believe himself to be this messianic figure, and relied on Kabbalistic proofs to confirm his divine mission. Well, the movement came to a shocking end, because he had reached a point where his following probably included at least a third, maybe half of the Jews of Europe and Asia Minor. He confidently goes to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire and says, how about it, King? Let's let the Jews go back to Palestine. And basically the Sultan said, convert to Islam or we're cutting off your head, whereupon he put on a fez and converted to Islam. Shockwaves all through the Jewish world. Every ghetto in Europe was devastated. Some of these people followed him into conversion. His primary prophet, Nathan of Gaza, became a Roman Catholic. It was a very disillusioning experience. And the Orthodox among the Jews said, well, you see, this magical, mystical stuff is really bad, and it corrupts people, and you need to stay away from it. And the movement collapsed for a while. Re-emerged in the 1700s under the auspices of the next messianic figure by the name of Jacob Frank, who had somewhat different ideas. We'll get to that in a moment. In the 1700s, and this was a gradual process, something happened. You have the Rosicrucian ferment on one side of Europe, of the general magical thing, with these little ideas of something funny is going on among the Jews. They're talking about mystical experiences and going back to